gentleman's time has expired. All time for opening statements has been completed. We're now going to turn to our very distinguished witness panel. I will advise the panelists before we begin that I am going to strictly enforce the 5-minute rule. So my advice to you would be this. I am going to introduce you so everyone will know who you are. You will not have to reintroduce yourself. If you've got 3 key points and they're on page 3 of your testimony, move them up to the top. And then at the very end, at this time left over, you can tell us more about your wonderful organizations. Okay? But get to your key points. I will be tapping the gavel right at 5 minutes. So please try to make sure that you think in those terms as we're going along. Our first witness is Mr. Thomas Karl, Director of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Climate Data Center. Dr. Karl has had a distinguished scientific career and has served as lead author on many key scientific reports, including as a lead author on the recent 4th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and as the co-chair of the National Assessment on Climate Variability and Change. We thank you for joining us, Mr. Karl. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Chairman Markey, Ranking Member Upton, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. First, I do want to make note that Dr. Lipchenko, our new administrator for NOAA, sends her regrets for not being able to be here today. This is her 3rd day on the job, and she looks forward to working with the committee in the future. I wanted to mention that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change definition of climate change refers to climate change over time, whether due to natural variability or the result of human activity. One of the things that we've already seen is many observed changes in the climate within the United States and globally. These include changes in air and water temperature, sea level, fresh water, severity of intense hurricanes. These kinds of changes are likely to increase and continue and have profound effects on the physical and biological environment, our economic prosperity, human health, and national security. There are typically 2 courses society can take to respond to climate-related impacts. First is mitigation. Mitigation meaning options for reducing heat-treating gases. Second is adaptation. Adaptation meaning changes that can be made to better respond to present or future climate change and other environmental conditions, thereby reducing harm and taking advantage of whatever opportunities a changing climate may present. Adaptation can include a wide variety of activities, farmers deciding to grow crops in a different way, moving business centers away from coasts, protecting coastlines. There's a countless number of adaptation plans that already have been devised. A few of them have actually been implemented, but very few. NOAA is the nation's provider of weather and climate data and information. We assemble this from a great variety of sources. NOAA's climate information services result from a long history of collaboration, coordination with our sister agencies, NASA, USGS, USDA, National Science Foundation, other government agencies. Climate information such as drought forecasts, long-term precipitation trends, fire forecasts, the frequency and intensity of coastal storms are all examples of the kinds of information that NOAA provides and will be useful for adaptation plans and strategies that will be developed by resource managers. NOAA works with customers and stakeholders to ensure we're providing high-quality information that is user-friendly, responsive, relevant to the issues being addressed. Increasing demands today for adaptation information, however, are now straining the ability of the agency to provide the kinds of information that's being requested at the appropriate space and time scales. Some of the categories for climate information, products and services, technical assistance training that NOAA provides today include scientific assessments of climate change and impacts, as the Chairman has mentioned. We work with a number of partners in providing information services in support of adaptation. This would include applications to living marine resources, applications to coastal communities, applications to water resources, just to name a few. In closing, I wanted to mention that despite the substantial efforts that NOAA has had to date, there still remain significant knowledge gaps and uncertainties for adaptation, as well as impediments to flows of knowledge and information relevant for decision makers. In addition, the scale at which reliable information is produced does not always match what is needed for adaptation decisions. We have considerable information about and confidence about changes in broad-scale aspects of climate change. Often questions are asked of us to provide local and regional information where the certainty is less apt to be as confidently applied as might otherwise be in a more general case. So there's clearly a need for some new tools and new science to ensure that adaptation progresses at the most appropriate pace. An effective response to changing climate conditions is going to require integrated, flexible, and responsive government-wide approach. To help this need, NOAA has been working to build on existing capacities to create seamless integrated processes for transferring climate science information to society and allow for informed decision-making and development of adaptation activities at federal, state, and local levels. I thank you for letting me have this opportunity today and be happy to answer questions subsequently.
We thank you, Mr. Carl. Our next witness is Mr. John Stevenson. He is the Director for Natural Resources and Environment for the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Stevenson has appeared many times before this committee to provide GAO's perspective on energy and environmental issues. We welcome you back, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Upton, and members of the subcommittee. I'm here today to give GAO's perspective on how the United States is adapting to actual and anticipated changes in the climate. Thus far, attention and resources have focused largely on emissions reduction options, climate science research, and technology investment. However, adaptation is beginning to receive more attention because the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere are expected to continue altering the climate system regardless of efforts to control emissions. While it may be costly to build coastal dikes to protect communities from sea level rise, or to build higher bridges, or to improve stormwater systems, there is a growing recognition in the United States and elsewhere that the cost of inaction could be greater. My testimony addresses the actions federal, state, local, and international authorities are currently taking to adapt to changing climate, the key challenges these officials are facing in their efforts to adapt, and the actions that Congress and federal agencies could take to help address these challenges. The information in my testimony is based largely on prior GAO work, but also draws on our ongoing study for this subcommittee. In summary, we found that a variety of adaptation-related activities are underway at different levels of government, including federal efforts like NOAA's to provide information and guidance to decision makers. In addition, federal resource management agencies like the Departments of Interior and Agriculture are beginning to consider climate change in their planning activities. We also found that certain state, local, and international governments are developing and implementing climate change adaptation plans. For example, we just completed a site visit exploring Maryland's strategy for reducing its vulnerability to climate change, focusing on sea level rise and coastal storms. We found that the state has completed an extensive mapping effort to identify coastal vulnerability and has begun educating coastal communities about changes that can be made to local ordinances to reduce coastal erosion and increase resilience. Specifically, Maryland provided guidance to 3 coastal counties recommending changes to planning documents, building codes, and local laws to address the risk resulting from sea level rise. We attended a public meeting held within the county threatened by sea level rise and observed how difficult it was to come to a resolution about the cost and trade-offs associated with taking versus not taking adaptive measures. Several of our recent reports illustrate a number of challenges faced by government officials in attempting to address climate change adaptation. First, climate change is one of many priorities competing for their attention. Second, a lack of guidance can constrain the ability of officials to consider climate change in management and planning decisions. Third, insufficient site-specific information can reduce the ability of officials to manage the effects of climate change on the resources they oversee. And finally, officials are struggling to make decisions based on projected future climate scenarios rather than past conditions. On this last point, a recent report by the National Resource Council stated that decision makers are not prepared to manage or plan for adaptation because many of their usual practices assume a continuation of past climate conditions. According to the NRC, this assumption is no longer valid because climate change will create a new and constantly changing decision environment. Our own 2000 report on FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, which insures properties against flooding, and USDA's Federal Crop Insurance Corporation, which insures crops against drought or other weather disasters, reached similar conclusions. Both highlighted how historical information may no longer be a reliable guide for decision-making. Unlike private sector insurers, neither federal insurance program had considered how climate change could affect their portfolios over the near or long term, potentially exposing the programs and taxpayers to greater financial risk. Our ongoing work for this committee will continue to explore these other adaptation issues and identify actions that can be taken to help move adaptation programs forward. To date, preliminary observations suggest a need for 1, improving coordination among federal agencies and with state and local governments, 2, preparing a national adaptation strategy and better guidance, and 3, developing regional and sector-specific information on the impacts of climate change. Some have also suggested the creation of a centralized government entity to collect and publicly share information about climate change impacts and adaptation strategies. We plan to continue to obtain information and perspectives from a broad range of federal, state, and local stakeholders, and later this year issue a report to the committee on the results of our work. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my statement, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
And we thank you, Mr. Stevenson, very much. Our next witness is Mr. Larry Schwager, who is the President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. Previously, Mr. Schwager served as President and CEO of the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and as the first Vice President of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. He currently chairs the Green Group, a coalition of environmental organizations. We welcome you back, and whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee.
The microphone in just a little bit closer, please.
Yep. America has been blessed with an abundance of natural resources. Born and raised as a hunter and angler, I can say that our unique wildlife heritage has helped define the traditions and values of my family, and I know of many other American families for generations. Since the conservation leadership of President Theodore Roosevelt, millions of Americans have devoted themselves to protecting and restoring our country's natural resources. Now, because of unchecked global warming, a century of conservation achievement is in jeopardy. Today's hearing is essentially about whether Congress will ensure our children and their children are not left in a world that's fundamentally different from the one that we have enjoyed. I ask you, Mr. Chairman and subcommittee members, are you ready to talk about a world that no longer has polar bears, vast sagebrush steppe and free-roaming antelope, ice fishing and deep snows in the winter, cold water rivers teeming with salmon and trout? It's not an exaggeration to call what we're facing a climate crisis. In fact, the problem with the debate is so far is that the climate change has consistently been underestimated. The conservative projections that have framed this story for many years are now being surpassed at a rate that has even shocked scientists closely monitoring the changes. Congress must enact a two-part agenda in its climate and energy legislation to adequately address the climate crisis. First, Congress must cap global warming pollution now and begin steadily and rapidly reducing at a rate and pace dictated by the science and by the precautionary principles. Reducing carbon pollution in the atmosphere is the only way to head off the worst impacts of the climate change on people and on wildlife. Secondly, Congress must use the revenues from the carbon cap program to carry out a program that is clean, green, and fair. Clean because we must invest in clean energy technologies to move to a new place in this country. Green because we must provide a large-scale dedicated funding to protect our nation's wildlife and other natural resources from climate change. And fair because we must protect consumers and particularly help those who are most vulnerable around the world. I want to emphasize, if we cap carbon pollution but fail to invest adequately in natural resource protection, we will have accomplished only half of the job. Because we have already committed so much global warming pollution to the atmosphere, we will necessarily be grappling with the harmful impacts to wildlife for decades to come. National Wildlife Federation is working with scientists, resource managers, and a coalition of more than 700 hunting, fishing, and conservation organizations from every state in the nation to urge Congress to design climate legislation that conserves wildlife and other natural resources from the impacts of global warming. You'll see from the attached to my written testimony a set of principles from the National Wildlife Federation and 19 other national conservation and sporting organizations calling for large-scale dedicated funding for natural resource adaptation and for identifying key legislative provisions to ensure that expenditures of such funding is science-based and strategic. Also attached is a letter from 612 leading scientists highlighting the urgency of the issue and also calling for large-scale dedicated funding to the purpose of adaptation. We are gratified to see President Obama pledge in his campaign to use dedicated funding from the climate legislation for natural resource adaptation. We're also pleased that our coalition's principles were largely reflected in the Climate Security Act passed by the Senate Environmental Public Works Committee last year. Conservation practitioners have already started planning their natural resource adaptation efforts across the country, but planning will be wasted without the resources to put that program on the ground. Some have argued that funds for safeguarding natural resources should come from sources other than a CAP program. However, the principle of polluter pays must apply here. Any legislation that allows companies to pay to pollute must dedicate a portion of those payments to repair the current and future damages caused by that pollution. Mr. Chairman, the fourth report of the IPCC warns that in the lifetime of a child born today, 20 to 30% of the world's plant and animal species will be on the brink of extinction if we don't take action now. It makes it clear that unless we both cut carbon emissions and invest in adaptation, we could easily lose over 1 million species. To meet our fundamental ethical duty to pass on a healthy planet to future generations, we must reduce carbon pollution, and we must invest now in natural resource adaptation. We must protect the natural world that protects us and our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Swiger, very much. Our next witness is Dr. Calvin Beisner, who is the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Dr. Beisner also serves on the pastoral staff of Holy Trinity Presbyterian Church in Broward County, Florida. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Beisner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Upton, and members of the committee.
With that microphone in just a little bit closer.
I have prepared a more extensive documented written testimony and submit it for the record. When the Apostle Paul wrote to the Galatians about meeting with the other apostles early in his ministry, he said, "They only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I also was eager to do." That has been my motivation for over 25 years of study and writing on developmental and environmental economics. Both the Old and the New Testaments insist that rulers protect the poor from harm, following the example of Yahweh, who, Psalm 140, verse 12 tells us, will maintain the cause of the afflicted and justice for the poor. Yet often the very people who are responsible to protect the poor make laws that, whether intentionally or not, harm them. Climate change legislation may, I fear, be one such case. The naturalist atheistic worldview sees Earth and all its ecosystems as the result of chance processes and therefore inherently unstable and fragile, vulnerable to enormous harm from tiny causes. The biblical worldview sees Earth and its ecosystems as the effect of a wise God's creation and providential preservation, and therefore robust, resilient, and self-regulating, thus preventing small perturbations from setting off a catastrophic cascade of reactions. Both this biblical worldview and high-quality scientific empirical findings convince me that the fear of catastrophic man-made global warming is mistaken, and if so, fighting it is a waste. But even if not, fighting it may still be a mistake. The most thorough comparisons between the costs and benefits of temperature mitigation on the one hand and adaptation through economic growth on the other have concluded resoundingly that adaptation wins hands down. I'm aware that the Stern Review argues that the costs of doing nothing will exceed those of fighting warming, but it reaches that conclusion by assuming, among other mistakes, a zero-time discount rate to compare the values of present and future costs. If you doubt the buffoonery of that, see me afterward. I'd like to borrow $1 million for 90 years at zero interest. What concerns me most is the impact of climate policy on the poor. If we tax CO2 emissions, which, after all, enhance plant growth and so benefit all of life, if we tax them, whether directly or via cap and trade, we raise the price of energy and so the prices of all things made and transported by energy, which is essentially everything. This is particularly devastating to the poor, for whom energy constitutes a higher proportion of spending than for others. Forcing the poor in the developing world, as must be done if we seriously mean to stabilize CO2, to forego the use of carbon-based fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, the cheapest fuels per kilowatt hour of energy delivered, means delaying by decades or generations the time when they can afford electricity for their homes and industries, and thus delays for similar periods the time when they can refrigerate their food and so protect it from spoilage and themselves from undernutrition for lack of food and diseases from spoiled food. When they can heat their homes with clean electricity rather than by open fires of wood and dry dung, the smoke from which causes respiratory diseases that reduce the amount of work they can do and so reduce their incomes and kill 2 to 4 million per year. When they can air condition their homes and so close windows and doors, keeping out insects that spread malaria, dengue fever, and other diseases that kill millions every year and disable scores to hundreds of millions. As Lomborg puts it, in the third world, access to fossil fuels is crucial. About 1.6 billion people don't have access to electricity, which seriously impedes development. 2.5 billion people use biomass, such as wood, waste, and dung, to cook and keep warm. About 1.3 million people, mostly women and children, die each year due to heavy indoor air pollution. A switch from biomass to fossil fuels would dramatically improve 2.5 billion lives. Inexpensive fossil fuels contributed enormously to the economic development of the wealthy countries of the world. To demand that poor countries forgo their use is to deprive them of that benefit and is, I insist, a grave injustice. It is the demand of wealthy, powerful elites at the expense of the vulnerable poor. No alternative fuels can compete at present with fossil fuels for price. To compel their use in order to reduce CO2 emissions is therefore to raise the price of energy and to harm the poor. Until someone can justify such a regressive tax with its fatal consequences, I can only conclude that it is unethical and that we are morally obligated not to impede access by the poor to abundant, inexpensive fossil fuels. Thank you.
We thank you very much for being here. Our next witness is Lord Christopher Monckton. He is the Viscount of Brenchley. Lord Monckton is the Chief Policy Advisor to the Science and Public Policy Institute from 1982 to 1986. Lord Monckton served as a special advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Please proceed, Lord Monckton.
Sir, I bring fraternal greetings from the Mother of Parliaments to the great Congress of your athletic democracy, and I pray that God's blessing may rest upon your councils. The right response to the non-problem of global warming, first slide please, is to have the courage to do nothing. Slide please. Thank you. There has been global cooling, as you see on that slide, for 7 years. The UN's climate panel has exaggerated carbon dioxide's effect on temperature 7-fold, verified by satellite observation, next slide please, that the diminution over time in outgoing long-wave radiation is 1/7 of that which the UN's computer models were told to predict. Next slide please. Carbon dioxide is accumulating in the air at less than half the rate that the United Nations had imagined. This century, we may warm the world by just half a Fahrenheit degree, if that. Next slide, please. If doing nothing is inexpedient, adaptation to warmer or cooler weather, when and if necessary, is many times more cost-effective than attempted mitigation. Adaptation to warmer weather is, of course, unnecessary unless the weather actually gets warmer. For 14 years, there has been no statistically significant global warming. Do not do or spend anything to mitigate or adapt to global warming until global temperature is 2 Fahrenheit degrees warmer than in 2000. That may not happen for at least a century. We have been adapting to natural variations in climate throughout the history of humankind. Adaptation is a practical, affordable, natural response to natural climate change. In the Middle Ages, it was warmer worldwide than today. Then global cooling set in. Our ancestors adapted. The Vikings abandoned their settlements in Greenland. Their graveyard at Valsay is under permafrost. It was frost-free when they were buried. In Europe, we adapted too. We moved to the valleys as the glaciers advanced, burying mountain roads, silver mines, and forests. Only now are all of these emerging once again. Adaptation, therefore, is at present unnecessary. Mitigation is always unnecessary. It is also disproportionately expensive, as Dr. Beisner has rightly pointed out. In particular, the impoverishing, regressive poll tax that is cap and trade has an ignominious past and no future. It has collapsed twice in Europe and once in New Zealand. If the United States adopts cap and trade, she may find herself doing so alone. Cap and trade will create green jobs by the thousand while destroying real jobs by the million at a cost of trillions. It is senseless. Green jobs are the new euphemism for mass unemployment. Cap and trade will perversely increase the global emissions it is intended to diminish. You will transfer your jobs, industries and wealth to India and China. Their emissions per unit of production are far greater than your own. Protectionist tariffs to try to prevent that are the last resort of the economically illiterate and the politically desperate. Tariffs always damage those nations who impose them, and they also flout your nation's obligations to the World Trade Organization. They are ultra vires. For proof of the economic damage caused by unilateral but futile attempts at influencing climate, see the galloping exodus from California. Everyone with any get up and go is getting up and going, and unlike their robotic governor, they won't be back. Or see the food riots in a dozen of the world's poorest regions after the biofuel scam that arose directly from the global warming scare doubled food prices in 18 months. A third of your farmland no longer grows food for people who need it, it grows fuel for automobiles that don't. For us, dearer food is inconvenient. For starving millions worldwide, as Dr. Beisner has pointed out, it is death. Next slide, please. In Haiti, the biofuel-driven doubling of world food prices has forced the poorest to eat mud pies made with real mud. There is serious starvation going on around the world now. And this is directly not as a result of global warming, there hasn't been any for 14 years, but as a result of policies intended to mitigate what does not need to be mitigated. You must apply the precautionary principle also to the precautions. And finally, next slide please, King Canute reminded his courtiers of the limitations of earthly power when the waves disobeyed his command not to wet the royal feet. You can no more command the forces of nature than could King Canute. For the sake of your taxpayers and of the poor whom their taxes support and defend, please don't try.
Good show, Lord Monkton. Very good show. Our next witness is Mr. David Wascow. Mr. Wascow is the Climate Change Program Director at Oxfam America. Before joining Oxfam, he worked for Friends of the Earth, where he focused on a range of international environmental and development issues. We welcome you, sir.
Good morning. Thank you. Oxfam is an international development and humanitarian organization that works in more than 120 countries, including the United States. And I am here today because our staff and partners are already responding to the serious impacts of climate change, including heat waves, severe storms, sea level rise, and reduced water supplies. Both in the United States and abroad, we believe it has become essential to develop innovative and effective adaptation strategies for vulnerable communities. And as I will note in a moment, we also believe that these strategies are an opportunity for economic growth, both at home and abroad. We witnessed the reality of climate impacts firsthand in our operations in the Gulf Coast, responding to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And although a particular weather-related event like Katrina cannot be specifically attributed to climate change, its impacts do stand as a tragic warning sign of the consequences if we fail to develop robust adaptation strategies. And let me just note for a moment here that I think our approach to climate change in general should be a proactive one, not reactive, and that is the case both in terms of reducing our emissions and also in doing adaptation, which is a matter of promoting resilience in a proactive manner. In the United States, low-income and other vulnerable populations will be disproportionately affected by climate change, as has been noted earlier. According to the recent findings of the federal U.S. Climate Change Science Program, many of the expected health effects are likely to fall heaviest on the poor, the elderly, the disabled, and the uninsured. Heat waves and extreme weather events are but two examples of climate impacts that will disproportionately affect the low-income and other vulnerable populations. As a first step to addressing these challenges in our country, the federal government should establish a national climate adaptation strategy, coordinate actions across agencies, and provide capacity-building assistance to state and local governments. All of these climate adaptation strategies should prioritize and include the participation of vulnerable communities, including improving the management of emergency response strategies for those who are most vulnerable. Internationally, the capacity of vulnerable communities in developing countries is even more limited and is being stretched even further than is the case here in the United States. Agricultural practices, water systems, disaster preparedness, and health systems will all need to be strengthened and improved in order to be more climate resilient. In these countries, the consequences of climate change reach significantly beyond direct impacts, of course. Stability and security will be undermined by climate change, and recently retired U.S. admirals and generals recommended that the U.S. take serious action to build climate resilience in those countries. Climate resilience, however, is not only a necessity, both in the United States and around the world. It is also smart economically. Taking preventive action now will pay for itself many times over, and studies have shown that reducing disaster risk saves $4 for every dollar spent on disaster preparedness. Adaptation strategies are also a key economic opportunity that we should seize. Innovative solutions can be an integral part of a global transition to a clean and climate-resilient economy. From developing climate-resilient buildings to buttressing sustainable transport systems to improving water systems and agricultural practices around the world, we can find substantial economic benefits from adaptation strategies. In the Gulf Coast, we have been involved with a promising example of climate-resilient economic development, building green, climate-resilient housing. And we are seeing the development of new markets at home and abroad for technologies and services to help communities build resilience. Water pumps and filtration devices, irrigation equipment, early warning systems for weather events, and weather-indexed microinsurance. U.S. companies and workers are well poised to partner with communities at home and abroad in deploying these technologies and services. For example, Pentair, a Minnesota-based company, manufactures pumps and filters for the entire water cycle and recently installed and maintained filtration systems in rural communities in India and Honduras. The development of new clean energy technologies to support climate adaptation and resilience, both here and in developing countries, is another economic opportunity. And I would just take a moment to note that in many cases, off-grid renewable energy technologies are in fact the most cost-effective, best way to provide energy sources to the poor in developing countries. Out of necessity, a wave of innovation is possible if we seize this opportunity to tackle climate adaptation and resilience that stands before us. So I encourage you to seize that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. And our final witness is Bishop Callan Holloway, who was recently elected to his third term as Bishop of the Southern Ohio Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Prior to that, he served as assistant to the Bishop of the Southern Ohio Synod and pastor of the Weston Lutheran Church in Dayton. Please begin whenever you feel comfortable, Bishop.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Markey and Congressman Upton and members of the committee. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. And I am with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and also representing that the National Council of Churches. Between them, the 5 million members of the ELCA and the 45 million in the National Council of Churches, I speak in their behalf. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak from the perspective of those of us involved in the faith community, as we're called, and to speak with you about global climate change. particularly are concerned for those who are living in poverty around the world and here, who are already facing the impacts of this climatic change. For many people of faith, the call to be good stewards of the earth is grounded in God's command in Genesis to keep and to till the earth. Christians look to Christ's example and heed the call to seek justice, care for our neighbor, and provide for those who are living in poverty or otherwise oppressed. And our response to climate change must reflect the principles of stewardship and justice. Particularly for those who are living in poverty around the world, they are the ones who are least responsible for the changes taking place and most likely to suffer from its impacts. The diverse coalition of faith communities, including Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals, and our interfaith partners, have endorsed the climate fairness agenda, which unites our communities behind the goal of working to ensure that the United States government aggressively reduces greenhouse gas emissions while providing for the most vulnerable here in our own country and around the world. And I'd like to submit to you, for the record, a document, Climate Fairness Agenda, a religious call to address global climate change and poverty.
We will include that in the record without
Thank you very much, sir. In its 2007 assessment reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, paints a pretty bleak picture of God's creation and those already struggling with hunger and disease. The report details how climate change will increase food insecurity in places where food is already scarce, while reversing progress made to fight against hunger in other regions. Rising temperatures will increase water scarcity in some areas and spread of disease such as malaria, fever, West Nile virus. More severe natural disasters and longer-term drought will lead to increased migration. I've seen this with my own eyes and worked with those who are working with the people who are most affected by this. I've been privileged to see this in my own church in our response to global climate change, through my own synods companionships in Tanzania, Brazil, and also in Kazakhstan most recently. And I've met farmers who are struggling with extreme weather pattern changes and unpredictable rainfalls. And our people are working hard, fast, furiously, and in partnership with great numbers and diversity of other people and organizations to provide basic water supply, cleanliness, and opportunities to eat. For us, we're blessed in our country with waking up in the morning and deciding what color tie to wear or what color iPod to have hanging from our sides, while most people around the world are waking up deciding if they're going to eat that day. Although churches and other NGOs are already working to assist communities adapting to climate change, the reality is that the changes are far too great for us to manage alone. We cannot do that alone. We are not structured for it. It is not our primary calling. A number of proposed bills in the House during the 110th session, including Chairman Markey, your recommendation with the ICAP bill, and Congressman Doggett's Climate Matters bill, and the Boxer-Warner-Lieberman bill in the Senate, include an international adaptation assistance language and funding. There are several items I'd like to get to in this report. The funds should be appropriately targeted in terms of recipient countries, by 10%. Local communities must be engaged in a participatory process through transparent mechanisms, and funds should be provided to fund the current levels of official development assistance. The funds should be targeted for climate impact, and legislation should enhance developing country efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The U.S. must acknowledge its role, both claimed and granted, in the responsibility for this global crisis, and should commit to providing substantial financial support, reaching between $7 and $21.5 billion a year by 2030. It's Some will say we cannot afford to make this sort of investment at a time of global economic turmoil. I counted that if we do not do it, we cannot afford that either. I thank you very much as we look to protect creation and God's people.
Thank you, Bishop Holloway, and to the other 6 witnesses watching you go 1 minute over. I went to religious school every day from age 6 to 26, 20 years in a row, and I don't have it within me to tell anyone wearing a collar when to stop. Okay, so I'm disciplined
May I
to think that way. So I apologize to the other witnesses, but I was gripped by the admonitions of those 20 years every day in religious school.